What if I told you there was a race car so revolutionary, so utterly bizarre, that it literally sucked itself to the track? Not metaphorically. Not as some kind of marketing slogan. Literally, physically, mechanically vacuumed itself onto the pavement with such ferocity that it generated more downforce sitting completely still in the pit lane than most cars could produce screaming down the straight at 150 miles per hour. This wasn't some futuristic concept car rendered in a design studio. This wasn't an engineering fever dream sketched on a napkin at a conference. This was real. This was racing. This was the Chaparral 2J, and the story of why it existed for just one season, competed in just 4 races, never won a single one of them, and yet fundamentally changed motorsport forever, is one of the most extraordinary tales in the entire history of competitive racing. This is Motorsport Heritage, and I spend way too much time thinking about banned racing technology and the engineers who dared to build what everyone else said was impossible. If you're someone who loves the intersection of radical engineering, motorsport history, and the kind of stories that make you ask, what if everything had gone differently, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Now, before we get into the details of how this car worked, I want you to picture something. Close your eyes for a second, or don't, because you're watching a video, but just imagine it. It's July 1970. You're standing at Road America in Elkhart Lake, Wisconsin. The grid is lined with the most ferocious racing cars on the planet. McLarens with their screaming big block Chevrolets, Lolas, Ferraris, machines bristling with wings and spoilers, all of them representing the absolute cutting edge of what an unlimited budget and the finest engineering minds of the era could produce. Then, at the back of the grid, there's something that doesn't belong. A white box. Literally a white box on wheels. No elegant curves, no dramatic wings sweeping up into the sky. Just this aggressively boxy, almost comically utilitarian body with what appears to be a snow fence skirt running around its bottom edges. And where the rear window should be on a normal car, 2 massive fans that look like they were borrowed from an industrial ventilation system. When driver Vic Elford fires it up, the sound hits you somewhere primal. Underneath the familiar thunder of a big block Chevy, there's something else entirely. A banshee wail. A mechanical screaming that doesn't belong on a racetrack. Track marshals instinctively step backward. Loose debris starts swirling behind the car like a miniature tornado. And then, something happens that makes every engineer in the paddock go completely silent. The car squats. Not from acceleration. Not from any mechanical loading. Just sitting there, stationary, at idle speed, the Chaparral 2J compresses its own suspension under the weight of aerodynamic downforce it's generating from a complete standstill. 1.5 grams of downforce. Generated at 0 miles per hour. Let that sink in for a moment, because that single fact changes everything about how you understand this machine. Here's the thing about the Can-Am series in the late 1960s. It was the Wild West of motorsport. And I mean that in the most literal, glorious, slightly terrifying way possible. The rulebook was basically a suggestion. Unlimited engine displacement. Minimal safety restrictions by modern standards. 2 seats, 4 wheels, and a pulse. And you were eligible to race. This philosophical freedom attracted the biggest engineering budgets, the most creative minds, and the most dangerous machines that motorsport had ever seen. According to period records, Can-Am cars of this era were producing somewhere between 600 and 700 horsepower from naturally aspirated V8 engines at a time when a fast road car might offer 300. These were genuinely terrifying machines driven by genuinely fearless men around circuits that offered very little in the way of runoff or forgiveness. McLaren dominated the series with ruthless efficiency. Bruce McLaren and Denny Hulme in their orange M8 series cars were the benchmark against which everything else was measured. They had factory support, factory resources, and a systematic approach to development that most competitors simply couldn't match. In 1969, McLaren won 11 of 12 races. 11 of 12. That's not dominance. That's annihilation. That's the kind of winning that makes other competitors question whether they should even bother showing up. The series needed something to shake it up, though nobody quite anticipated the form that shaking would take. Jim Hall was not a typical racing team owner, and I want to be really clear about that distinction because it matters enormously to understanding everything that follows. Most team owners in this era were businessmen who loved racing, or wealthy enthusiasts who could afford to indulge their passion at the highest level. Hall was something categorically different. He held an engineering degree from the California Institute of Technology, one of the most rigorous technical institutions on the planet. He'd built his personal fortune through the oil business. He approached racing the way an engineer approaches any complex problem, which is to say, he started from first principles rather than convention, and he had absolutely no patience for doing something a particular way simply because that was how it had always been done. Here's what most people don't realize about Hall's competitive philosophy. While everyone else in the late 1960s was focused on the horsepower race, on extracting more power from bigger engines, Hall was obsessed with something that sounds almost obvious once you understand it, but was genuinely revolutionary in practice. He understood with crystalline clarity that speed doesn't win races. Cornering wins races, and cornering is entirely a function of grip. You can have 1,000 horsepower, but if you can't put that power through the tires in a controlled, consistent, predictable way, you're just making spectacular noise while faster cars disappear into the distance. Hall had already proven this philosophy worked. His Chaparral 2E, which appeared in 1966, introduced the high-mounted adjustable rear wing to Can-Am racing. It looked insane. People laughed at it. Then it started generating downforce that transformed cornering speeds, and people stopped laughing very quickly. The 2F followed with movable aerodynamics that the driver could adjust mid-corner. Again, revolutionary. Again, eventually copied by everyone else, and that was precisely the problem by 1969. Hall had been so influential that his innovations had become industry standard. The wings he pioneered were now on every car. The aerodynamic advantage he'd worked so hard to create had been democratized. He needed something else, something so conceptually different that it couldn't simply be bolted onto an existing design. McLaren dominated the series with ruthless efficiency. Bruce McLaren and Denny Hulme in their orange M8 series cars were the benchmark against which everything else was measured. They had factory support, factory resources, and a systematic approach to development that most competitors simply couldn't match. In 1969, McLaren won 11 of 12 races. 11 of 12. That's not dominance. That's annihilation. That's the kind of winning that makes other competitors question whether they should even bother showing up. The series needed something to shake it up, though nobody quite anticipated the form that shaking would take. Jim Hall was not a typical racing team owner, and I want to be really clear about that distinction because it matters enormously to understanding everything that follows. Most team owners in this era were businessmen who loved racing, or wealthy enthusiasts who could afford to indulge their passion at the highest level. Hall was something categorically different. He held an engineering degree from the California Institute of Technology, one of the most rigorous technical institutions on the planet. He'd built his personal fortune through the oil business. He approached racing the way an engineer approaches any complex problem, which is to say, he started from first principles rather than convention, and he had absolutely no patience for doing something a particular way simply because that was how it had always been done. Here's what most people don't realize about Hall's competitive philosophy. While everyone else in the late 1960s was focused on the horsepower race, on extracting more power from bigger engines, Hall was obsessed with something that sounds almost obvious once you understand it, but was genuinely revolutionary in practice. He understood, with crystalline clarity, that speed doesn't win races. Cornering wins races. And cornering is entirely a function of grip. You can have 1,000 horsepower, but if you can't put that power through the tires in a controlled, consistent, predictable way, you're just making spectacular noise while faster cars disappear into the distance. Hall had already proven this philosophy worked. His Chaparral 2E, which appeared in 1966, introduced the high-mounted adjustable rear wing to Can-Am racing. It looked insane. People laughed at it. Then it started generating downforce that transformed cornering speeds, and people stopped laughing very quickly. The 2F followed with movable aerodynamics that the driver could adjust mid-corner. Again, revolutionary. Again, eventually copied by everyone else. And that was precisely the problem by 1969. Hall had been so influential that his innovations had become industry standard. The wings he pioneered were now on every car. The aerodynamic advantage he'd worked so hard to create had been democratized. He needed something else, something so conceptually different that it couldn't simply be bolted onto an existing design. Now, you might be thinking, 1.5 pounds per square inch doesn't sound like very much. And you'd be right, in isolation. But here's the thing about pressure differentials. The force they generate depends entirely on the area over which they act. And the underside of the Chaparral 2J had a carefully maximized flat floor area of approximately 4,000 square inches. Multiply 1.5 pounds per square inch by 4,000 square inches, and you get 6,000 pounds of downforce. 6,000 pounds of mechanical grip generated entirely independently of vehicle speed. For context, the car itself weighed 1,800 pounds, fully fueled. The 2J was pressing itself onto the track with a force more than 3 times its own weight before it had moved an inch. No wing in 1970 could come close to those numbers, and no wing could deliver them at 0 miles per hour. This was a completely different category of performance. But generating the suction was only half the equation, and in many ways, the easier half. The harder problem was containment. For the low pressure under the car to be maintained, the gap between the car's body and the track surface had to be effectively sealed. Air is extraordinarily good at finding the path of least resistance. If there was any gap, any opening around the perimeter of the car, high-pressure outside air would rush in to equalize the pressure differential, and the downforce would collapse. Hall's solution was the skirt system. And it's worth spending some time here because the skirts were simultaneously the most innovative and most troublesome element of the entire design. Flexible panels of Lexan polycarbonate plastic ran along the bottom edges of the car's body, maintaining contact with the track surface and preventing outside air from rushing underneath. These weren't rigid panels. They were mounted on a sophisticated spring-loaded articulation system that allowed them to move vertically as the car traveled over bumps, expansion joints, curbs, and the inevitable imperfections of real racetrack surfaces. Springs pushed them continuously downward against the track. They could articulate upward over obstacles without breaking the seal, then snap back into contact immediately afterward. The concept was ingenious. The execution was a constant source of mechanical anxiety throughout the car's entire racing life. Lexan polycarbonate is a tough material, but no material survives continuous high-speed contact with abrasive tarmac indefinitely. The skirts wore rapidly. A complete set might last a single race distance under good conditions, less if the track surface was particularly rough or if the driver used curbs aggressively. More critically, a damaged or missing skirt section didn't just reduce downforce slightly. It created a pressure leak that could collapse the entire suction system almost instantaneously. And because the skirt damage often happened progressively during a race, the car's handling would degrade in ways that were unpredictable and potentially catastrophic. Drivers described the sensation as the car suddenly deciding it no longer wanted to corner. In the middle of a corner, with no warning whatsoever. And then there was the debris problem. This one sounds almost comical until you think through the physics. Those fans were moving nearly 10,000 cubic feet of air per minute from underneath the car. That air didn't flow cleanly and invisibly. It carried with it everything that was on the track surface in the car's path. Rubber marbles deposited by tire wear, stones, grit, pieces of bodywork from earlier incidents, small fragments of curbing. All of it got sucked under the car, passed through the fan system, and ejected violently from the rear of the car at high velocity. During early testing at Hall's private Rattlesnake Raceway facility near Midland, Texas, the debris field behind the 2J was so severe that a following car had its windshield completely destroyed by a shower of gravel. They had to install protective mesh screens over the fan exits, which was the sensible safety solution but reduced the fan's aerodynamic efficiency by nearly 20%. Even with the screens, following the 2J at close range was described by drivers as like driving through a sandstorm. Look, I want to take a moment here to talk about the heat, because it's one of those details that rarely gets mentioned in the headline story of the 2J, but was genuinely critical to the car's development. Those two JLO two-stroke fan engines were running at maximum output, continuously, for the entire duration of every session. Unlike the main Chevrolet V8, which at least had some variation in load depending on throttle position, the fan engines ran flat out from the moment the car left the pit lane to the moment it returned. The thermal output was enormous. The rear deck of the car became, in the words of one mechanic who worked on the project, essentially an oven. During early testing, bodywork panels in the rear section began showing heat distortion during extended runs. Heat shielding had to be added progressively until the rear of the car was heavily insulated, adding weight that Hall had never budgeted for. Even with all the shielding in place, pit crews working on the rear of the car after a session needed to wear heavy, protective gloves. Several mechanics suffered minor burns in the early months of development simply from brushing against components that looked cool, but weren't. The main chassis was a departure from Hall's previous work in ways that reflected both the unique demands of this car and the engineering constraints of the era. Rather than his usual fiberglass monocoque construction, the 2J used an aluminum semi-monocoque with a steel tube subframe. The body was deliberately, aggressively boxy, and this is one of those details that separates Hall's engineering thinking from conventional race car design of the period. Every other race car in 1970 was shaped the way it was shaped because of aerodynamic efficiency, because of drag reduction, because of the carefully managed airflow over and around the bodywork. The 2J's shape was determined by one thing only: maximizing the flat floor area underneath the car to maximize the surface over which the suction could act. Every square inch of underside area meant more downforce. Hall made the car as wide and as flat as the regulations permitted, and the result was something that looked, frankly, like it had been designed by someone who had never seen a race car before. Which was, in a very real sense, precisely the point. For the main power plant, Hall made a decision that surprised many observers at the time and continues to surprise people when they first encounter it. He chose a relatively conservative tune of the Chevrolet ZL1 all-aluminum 427 cubic inch big block V8, running a single 4-barrel carburetor rather than the multiple carburetors or fuel injection systems that competitors were using. The output was approximately 680 horsepower at 7,000 revolutions per minute, with 520 pound-feet of torque. This was, by the standards of 1970 Can-Am, a mild state of tune. McLaren's MAD was running engines producing closer to 750 horsepower. Hall was deliberately giving away power, betting that the cornering advantage from the suction system would more than compensate for the straight-line deficit. The transmission was a 3-speed automatic, which raised eyebrows throughout the paddock. Automatic gearboxes in racing were associated with lower-tier competition, with oval racing, with machinery that didn't demand the ultimate in driver engagement. Hall's reasoning was typically pragmatic. With constant speed-independent downforce available, the car could accelerate out of slow corners with such ferocity that manual gear changes would cost time. The automatic also freed the driver to focus entirely on managing the 2J's unique and deeply challenging handling characteristics, because this car demanded every ounce of concentration a driver possessed. Initial testing at Rattlesnake Raceway produced reactions that ranged from astonishment to genuine alarm. Development driver Phil Hill, the 1961 Formula One world champion, took the car for its first meaningful laps and came back to the pits wearing an expression that his colleagues described as somewhere between exhilaration and controlled terror. The cornering forces were unlike anything he had experienced in a career that had taken him to the absolute summit of motorsport. The car turned in with no understeer, no gradual buildup of lateral force, no progressive loading of the outside tires. It simply gripped, completely and immediately, and went wherever it was pointed with a directness that felt almost supernatural. But Hill also identified the characteristic that would define the 2J's reputation throughout its brief racing life. When the suction was disrupted, when a skirt section lifted over a bump or a debris fragment temporarily blocked part of the fan inlet, the transition from grip to no grip was instantaneous and completely without warning. One moment the car was generating forces that pressed you into the seat with the weight of 2 additional people. The next moment the tires had nothing, and the car was going wherever physics decided to send it rather than wherever the driver was steering. Jim Hall himself experienced this phenomenon firsthand during several testing incidents that would have ended most engineers' enthusiasm for the project permanently. During one session at Rattlesnake Raceway in early 1970, Hall was carrying the car through a high-speed sweeper at approximately 140 miles per hour when a section of the left side skirt caught on a raised expansion joint and tore away. The loss of downforce was not progressive. It was not gradual. It was absolute and instantaneous. One moment the car was tracking through the corner with the composure of a machine generating thousands of pounds of mechanical grip. The next moment, it was sliding sideways at racing speed with no more adhesion than a streetcar on wet pavement. Hall went off the circuit at enormous velocity, across the gravel trap, and into the barrier. He walked away, but the car was substantially damaged, requiring weeks of repair work. Rather than discouraging Hall, these incidents provided invaluable data about the failure modes of the skirt system and drove continuous refinement of the mounting hardware, the material specification, and the spring rates that maintained the skirts in contact with the track surface. Here's what most people don't realize about the development phase of the 2J. It wasn't just the mechanical systems that needed refinement. It was the entire conceptual framework for how to drive the car. Every racing driver in history had learned to feel the limit of grip through progressive feedback. You pushed harder, the tires started to complain. You eased off slightly, and you found the balance point between speed and adhesion. The 2J obliterated that learning curve. The grip was so overwhelming, so far beyond anything the tires would have provided on their own, that there was no progressive feedback zone. The car was either gripping completely or not gripping at all. Drivers had to learn an entirely new vocabulary of car control. Rather than modulating inputs based on tire feedback, they had to develop absolute trust in the suction system while simultaneously maintaining a survival plan for the moment it inevitably failed. This psychological challenge was arguably more difficult than the physical one. Jackie Stewart, the reigning Formula One world champion and widely considered the most technically proficient driver of his generation, was invited to test the 2J at Midland during the development phase. Stewart was known for his analytical approach to driving, his ability to describe in precise engineering terms exactly what a car was doing at every point on the circuit. After his first sequence of laps in the 2J, Stewart sat in the cockpit for several minutes before climbing out, which was unusual for a driver known for his crisp efficiency. When he finally spoke to Hall and the engineering team, he said 2 things that are worth recording. First, he called the 2J the most remarkable racing car he had ever driven. Second, he called it the most frightening. The grip levels, Stewart explained, were so far beyond normal that the car created an entirely false sense of security. You felt invincible. You felt as though the car could do anything, go anywhere, take any corner at any speed. And it could, right up until the moment the suction system encountered any disruption whatsoever, at which point you discovered that you had been traveling at speeds that no tire compound on Earth could sustain without mechanical assistance. Stewart, with characteristic precision, identified the fundamental paradox of the 2J. The system worked so well that it encouraged you to drive in a regime where its failure would be catastrophic. By early 1970, despite the challenges and the testing incidents and the constant mechanical refinement, the 2J was fast enough to take on the best cars in the world. Hall needed a driver for the competitive season, and he chose wisely. Vic Elford was a genuine all-rounder, one of those rare drivers who could be competitive in literally any category of motorsport. He had won the Monte Carlo Rally, the Targa Florio, and been a frontrunner at Le Mans, all in the same year. He was fast, mechanically sympathetic, and crucially, he was intelligent enough to understand the 2J's unique demands and brave enough to accept its risks. Elford's first experience in the car followed a pattern that was becoming familiar. Initial incredulity at the concept, followed by stunned silence after the first lap, followed by a detailed technical debriefing in which he identified exactly the same strengths and vulnerabilities that every other experienced driver had found. The grip was extraordinary, the failure modes were terrifying. And the noise, that unholy combination of big block V8 and screaming two-stroke fan engines, was unlike anything he had encountered in a career that had taken him around the most punishing circuits on the planet. The Can-Am establishment had been watching Hall's development with increasing unease throughout the winter and spring of 1970. Rumors had filtered out of Midland about the car's capabilities. Some of these rumors were exaggerated. Many were not. The initial reaction from competitors was dismissive. A vacuum cleaner on wheels. A gimmick. A clever idea that would never survive the punishment of actual racing. Bruce McLaren himself traveled to Texas to see the 2J during its testing phase. McLaren was not just a competitor. He was a trained engineer. A man who understood chassis dynamics and aerodynamics at a fundamental level. When he saw the 2J demonstrate its suction system for the first time, when he watched the car compress its own suspension from a standing start under nothing but self-generated downforce, his expression changed. According to witnesses, McLaren left the test session without his characteristic optimism. He told his team manager Teddy Mayer that the 2J was the most serious competitive threat he had ever seen. Look, I need to be honest about something here. The competitive history of the Chaparral 2J is simultaneously the most exciting and most frustrating story in motorsport. Because on the one hand, every race provided moments of such staggering performance that they rewrote what people believed was physically possible. And on the other hand, not a single race ended with the 2J taking a victory. The potential was limitless. The reliability was catastrophic, and the politics that surrounded the car were as ferocious as anything that happened on the track. The competition debut came at Road America in Elkhart Lake, Wisconsin, in July 1970. The paddock reaction to the 2J's arrival was immediate and intense. Mechanics from rival teams surrounded the car, peering underneath, studying the skirt system, trying to understand the fan arrangement. Some engineers laughed openly at its appearance. It genuinely looked like nothing else in the paddock, boxy and ungainly, and somehow wrong in a field of sleek, purposeful racing machines. Other engineers, the smarter ones, the ones who understood what they were looking at, went very quiet very quickly. During qualifying, the laughter stopped entirely. Despite being nearly 150 pounds heavier than the McLaren M8D, despite giving away approximately 70 horsepower to the best cars in the field, Vic Elford put the 2J on the front row of the grid, not through bravery, though Elford had that in abundance, through sheer, mechanical, physics-defying cornering speed. In the fast sweepers where aerodynamic downforce from conventional wings was at its maximum, the 2J was fast. In the slow, tight corners where conventional wings generated almost nothing, the 2J was devastating. The lap time sheet told a story that no amount of dismissive commentary could argue with. This ugly white box was among the fastest cars in the world. The race itself was a disaster, the first in a pattern that would repeat itself with heartbreaking consistency throughout the 2J's brief competitive career. 3 laps into the race, a drive coupling connecting one of the Jello fan engines to its fan shaft failed. The coupling was a relatively simple component, a flexible rubber element designed to absorb vibration between the engine and the fan. Under the sustained loading of continuous full-speed operation at racing temperatures, it simply disintegrated. Without both fans operating, the suction system couldn't maintain adequate pressure differential. The downforce disappeared. Elford, who moments earlier had been running at cornering speeds that made the McLarens look pedestrian, suddenly found himself driving an overweight, underpowered, aerodynamically inefficient brick with the handling characteristics of a delivery van. He retired to the pits. The competition exhaled collectively. Maybe this thing wasn't the existential threat they had feared. But at Watkins Glen, 2 weeks later, the 2J showed its true face. This is where it gets really interesting, because the performance at Watkins Glen wasn't just impressive. It was the kind of performance that fundamentally alters the competitive landscape of a racing series. Elford qualified the car on pole position. Not just on pole, but on pole by over a full second. In Can-Am racing, where the top 10 cars were typically separated by tenths of a second, where the difference between the front row and the third row might be less than a second total, Vic Elford and the Chaparral 2J were in a different dimension. A full second is an eternity in racing qualifying. It means that at every single point on the circuit, the 2J was operating at a level of performance that no other car could match. Not in the fast sections, not in the slow sections, not anywhere. The competitors were no longer dismissive. They were no longer bemused. They were angry, and they were scared. In the race, Elford led comfortably for 32 laps. The 2J looked absolutely dominant, pulling away from the second-place McLaren with the inevitability of a machine that was simply operating on a different plane of physics. Then a suspension pickup point failed, not a fan failure, not a skirt failure, a conventional, mundane, ordinary structural failure in the suspension mounting. The kind of thing that happens to racing cars regardless of how revolutionary their aerodynamic concept might be. Elford retired, and once again the 2J's result column showed nothing but a DNF. But here's the thing that matters. For 32 laps at Watkins Glen, the Chaparral 2J had made the best cars in the world look ordinary. Not slower. Not marginally inferior. Ordinary. And everyone in the paddock knew it. That gap, that devastating qualifying advantage, those 32 laps of utter dominance, they told a story that no amount of mechanical failure could erase. If the 2J's reliability could be sorted, if the fans kept spinning, if the skirts stayed intact, if the drive couplings held together, there was no car in the Can-Am series that could live with it. Not the McLarens, not the Porsches, not the Lolas, nothing. Jim Hall had not built a faster car. He had built a car that made speed itself work differently. The reaction from the competitor teams shifted dramatically after Watkins Glen. What had begun as curiosity, evolved into mockery, transformed into concern, now crystallized into coordinated, determined, political opposition. Teddy Mayer, the McLaren team principal who had inherited leadership of the team after Bruce McLaren's tragic death during testing just weeks before the 2J's debut, led the charge. Mayer filed formal protests at every subsequent race. He mobilized other team owners, other constructors, other stakeholders in the Can-Am series. The arguments were varied and strategically constructed. The fans created dangerous debris fields behind the car. The movable skirts violated the spirit, if not the letter, of regulations governing movable aerodynamic devices. The fan system could be construed as a form of auxiliary propulsion, making the car illegal on those grounds. Some arguments were more persuasive than others. The debris concern had genuine merit. Following the 2J at close range was genuinely hazardous, and several drivers complained formally about stones and rubber fragments being propelled into their cockpits at high velocity. The movable aerodynamic device argument was legally interesting but technically weak. The skirts didn't generate downforce. They maintained a seal. The fans weren't wings or spoilers. They were air extraction devices. Hall and his legal team argued, with considerable justification, that the 2J complied with both the letter and the spirit of the existing technical regulations. But racing has never been decided solely by technical regulations. It is decided equally by politics, by money, by the collective commercial interests of the participants, and by the willingness of sanctioning bodies to enforce or reinterpret their own rules. And the collective will of the Can-Am establishment was firmly, unambiguously, and increasingly desperately opposed to the continued existence of the Chaparral 2J. At Laguna Seca, the political pressure escalated to a level that threatened the very existence of the Can-Am series itself. Several teams, representing some of the most significant financial commitments in North American motorsport, informed the Sports Car Club of America that they would withdraw their entries if the Chaparral 2J was permitted to continue competing. This was not an idle threat. These were teams with major sponsorship agreements, teams whose participation was essential to the commercial viability of the series. Television contracts, circuit appearance fees, sponsor activations, all of these depended on a full, competitive grid. If 4 or 5 major teams walked away, the entire economic model of Can-Am racing collapsed overnight. The SECA found itself in an impossible position. On one hand, the 2J appeared to comply with the existing technical regulations. Hall had been meticulous about ensuring his car met every written requirement. Banning a legal car would set a dangerous precedent, signaling to every constructor that innovation beyond a certain undefined threshold would be punished regardless of its legality. On the other hand, allowing the 2J to continue racing might destroy the series entirely, not through any mechanical failure or safety incident, but through the simple economic reality that no team wanted to invest millions of dollars in conventional technology when a completely different approach had rendered that technology obsolete. Now, you might be thinking that this seems like an overreaction. One car, running unreliably, never having finished a race on the lead lap, threatening to destroy an entire racing series? But here's the thing you need to understand about competitive motorsport at this level. Teams don't react to what a car has done. They react to what it will do. Every engineer in the paddock could see the 2J's qualifying performances. They could see those 32 dominant laps at Watkins Glen. They could see that the car's failures were mechanical reliability issues, the kind of problems that get solved with development time and better components. The fundamental concept worked. It worked devastatingly well. Give Hall another winter of development, another season of refinement, better fan drive couplings, more durable skirt materials, improved cooling for those overworked two-stroke engines, and the 2J wouldn't just be competitive. It would be untouchable. Every team owner in the paddock was doing the same mental calculation. If the 2J is allowed to continue, we either have to build our own suction car or we accept permanent, systematic, fundamental inferiority. Building a suction car would require millions of dollars, years of development, and expertise that most teams simply didn't possess. Jim Hall had a relationship with General Motors. He had engineering resources that independent constructors couldn't match. The competitive landscape wouldn't just shift, it would be completely redrawn around a technology that one team had mastered and everyone else was scrambling to understand. The car's finest hour, and perhaps the most painful illustration of what might have been, came at Riverside International Raceway in October 1970. The circuit was a demanding combination of high-speed sweepers and tight, technical sections that rewarded exactly the kind of speed-independent downforce that the 2J generated. Elford qualified on pole position once again, the car's suction system working flawlessly through qualifying. The fans screaming their banshee wail as the white box carved through corners at speeds that made experienced observers physically uncomfortable. In the race, Elford drove with the controlled aggression of a man who knew he was piloting something extraordinary and fragile in equal measure. He led from the start, pulling away from the pursuing McLarens with methodical precision. Behind the 2J, a rooster tail of debris marked its passage like a contrail behind a jet aircraft. The skirts scraped and sparked against the track surface, trailing tiny fireworks displays through every corner. The sound was overwhelming. A wall of mechanical fury that combined the deep roar of the Chevrolet big block with the high-frequency screaming of those two-stroke fan engines into something that spectators described as genuinely painful at close range. With 10 laps remaining, Elford held a lead of over 30 seconds. 30 seconds in a single race. To put that in modern context, that's the kind of margin you might see if a Formula One car competed against Formula 2 machinery. It's not a performance advantage, it's a performance category distinction. The 2J wasn't just beating the best cars in the world, it was operating in a fundamentally different competitive universe. Then, with the inevitability that had come to define the 2J's racing life, disaster struck. A rubber coupling in the fan drive system, The same type of component that had failed at Road America months earlier, disintegrated under the sustained thermal and mechanical loading. The suction disappeared. Elford described what happened next in an interview years later with a vividness that conveys the terror of the experience more effectively than any technical analysis. He said it was like someone had poured oil across the entire track surface. Not in one corner. Everywhere. Simultaneously. The tires that moments earlier had been generating cornering forces that pressed him sideways in his seat with the weight of 3 additional people suddenly had nothing. The car went from a precision instrument with apparently unlimited grip to something that felt like it was skating on glass. The fact that Elford kept the car on the circuit, that he managed to wrestle this suddenly uncontrollable machine through the remaining laps without a catastrophic accident, remains one of the most impressive displays of pure driving skill in Can-Am history. He finished third, which sounds respectable until you understand that he had been leading by half a minute just moments earlier. And this is where the story takes its most bitter turn, because the Riverside race was effectively the end of the Chaparral 2J as a competitive entity. Not because of mechanical failure, not because of any shortcoming in Jim Hall's engineering, but because of a decision made in a meeting room far from any racetrack. During the off-season, the Sports Car Club of America announced a comprehensive revision to the technical regulations governing Can-Am racing for the 1971 season. The revised rules explicitly prohibited movable aerodynamic devices, defined with a specificity that left no room for interpretation. The new regulations stated that any device whose primary purpose is to create a pressure differential between the upper and lower surfaces of the car through means other than the forward motion of the vehicle was prohibited. Read that sentence again carefully. It is one of the most precisely targeted pieces of regulatory language in the history of motorsport. It doesn't ban wings. It doesn't ban spoilers. It doesn't ban conventional ground effect. It bans exactly one thing: the operating principle of the Chaparral 2J. The rule might as well have included Jim Hall's home address. Hall was furious but not surprised. He had watched the political campaign against the 2J build throughout the 1970 season. He had seen the formal protests, the threatened withdrawals, the behind-closed-doors lobbying. He understood, with the clarity of a man who had spent his career challenging convention, that the establishment would protect itself from disruption using whatever tools were available. The rules of racing are not natural laws. They are human constructions, subject to human motivations, human fears, and human self-interest. The Sake had been presented with a choice between preserving the competitive status quo and allowing a technological revolution, and they had chosen the status quo. Hall briefly considered legal action but recognized its futility almost immediately. Racing sanctioning bodies operate with near absolute authority over the technical regulations of their series. Courts have historically been reluctant to intervene in what they consider internal sporting matters. A legal challenge would be expensive, protracted, and almost certainly unsuccessful. More importantly, even if Hall won in court, he would be racing under the authority of an organization that had explicitly demonstrated its hostility to his car. Technical inspections would become adversarial. Rule interpretations would go against him. The racing environment would be poisoned beyond recovery. There was brief discussion of taking the 2J to other series. The FIA, which governed international sports car racing, expressed interest in seeing the car compete in European events. The World Sports Car Championship had its own regulations, and there was at least an argument that the 2J might comply with them. But Hall was exhausted. The 2J project had consumed over $2 million, approximately $15 million in today's money when adjusted for inflation. General Motors had contributed additional resources, engineering support, and logistical backing. All of this for a car that had started 4 races and finished none of them in a competitive position. The engineering had been proven beyond any reasonable doubt. The concept worked, the performance was transformative. But the politics had been equally proven. The establishment would not allow this transformation to occur. Hall withdrew from Can-Am racing entirely. The 2J was wheeled back into the Chaparral workshop in Midland, Texas, and covered with a dust sheet. one of the most revolutionary machines in the history of motorsport, was retired at the age of 1 season, having never achieved a single race victory. Here's what most people don't realize about what happened next. The immediate impact of the 2J's banning was not to improve Can-Am racing. It was to accelerate its decline. Without the threat of radical innovation, without the engineering diversity that made this series intellectually compelling as well as visually spectacular, Can-Am became increasingly processional. McLaren continued to dominate, but the drama was fading. Audiences, who had been drawn to the series partly by the spectacle of wildly different engineering approaches competing against each other, began to drift away. Sponsors, who valued the narrative tension of genuine competition and technical innovation, started redirecting their budgets elsewhere. By 1974, the original Can-Am series was effectively dead, killed not by too much innovation, but by too little. The irony is as sharp as it is tragic. The establishment banned the 2J to preserve Can-Am racing, and in doing so they removed the very element of unpredictable, boundary-pushing innovation that had made Can-Am racing worth preserving. But the story of the 2J's influence was far from over. Ideas this powerful don't disappear just because a sanctioning body writes a new regulation. They go underground. They migrate to other series. They wait. In 1978, 8 years after the 2J's brief and turbulent career, a South African engineer named Gordon Murray designed a car that proved Jim Hall's concept had been exactly right all along. The Brabham BT46B Formula One car used a large fan mounted at the rear, ostensibly for engine cooling purposes, but with the unmistakable secondary effect of extracting air from under the car and generating massive speed-independent downforce. Murray, who was one of the most brilliant engineers in Formula One history, was well aware of the Chaparral 2J. He had studied Hall's work extensively and understood both its potential and its political vulnerabilities. The BT46B's fan was carefully designed to have a legitimate cooling function, providing Murray with a technical defense that Hall had never needed to construct for the 2J. Niki Lauda drove the BT46B to victory in its first and only race, the 1978 Swedish Grand Prix at Anderstorp. He didn't just win, he won by 34 seconds, a margin of victory that was almost obscene in a Formula One race. The car was so dominant, so obviously superior to everything else on the grid, that the reaction was immediate and identical to what had happened to the 2J 8 years earlier. Protests were filed before the champagne was dry on the podium. Teams threatened to withdraw. The governing body moved with unprecedented speed to ban the car before it could race again. The BT46B competed in exactly one race. The Chaparral 2J had managed 4. Together, they had 5 race starts and 1 victory, and they had collectively proven beyond any possible doubt that powered ground effect was the most effective method of generating downforce ever devised. And both had been eliminated not because they didn't work, but precisely because they worked too well. The parallels between the 2J and the BT46B tell us something profound about the relationship between innovation and institutional power in motorsport, and honestly, in human endeavor more broadly. Both cars represented genuine paradigm shifts, not incremental improvements, but fundamental reconceptions of how a racing car should interact with the road surface beneath it. Both were created by engineers who thought from first principles rather than convention. Both were eliminated by competitors who recognized that copying the innovation would be more expensive and more difficult than simply lobbying to have it banned. And both left behind a legacy that far exceeded their competitive records, influencing generations of engineers who studied what they had achieved and asked the question that all great engineering begins with: what if we tried something completely different? Look, I want to talk about the broader technical legacy of the 2J, because it extends far beyond the cars that directly copied its fan concept. When Colin Chapman designed the Lotus 79 for the 1978 Formula One season, the car that is universally credited with introducing ground effect to Formula One, he was solving the same problem that Jim Hall had identified a decade earlier. How do you generate downforce that doesn't depend entirely on vehicle speed? Chapman's solution was different in execution, using shaped undersides and venturi tunnels to accelerate airflow under the car and create low pressure through aerodynamic means rather than mechanical extraction. But the conceptual foundation was identical. The underside of the car is the key to generating downforce efficiently. The relationship between the car's floor and the track surface is more important than any wing or spoiler mounted on top of the bodywork. And sealing the edges of the car, preventing high-pressure air from migrating underneath and destroying the low-pressure zone, is critical to making any ground effect system work. Chapman's Lotus 79 used sliding skirts that ran along the bottom edges of the side pods, maintaining contact with the track surface. Does that sound familiar? It should. They were functionally identical to the skirts on the Chaparral 2J, serving exactly the same purpose of preventing pressure equalization. Chapman was too smart and too proud to directly acknowledge Hall's influence, but the engineering lineage is unmistakable. This is where it gets really interesting, because the ground effect revolution that Chapman initiated in 1978 transformed Formula One in exactly the way that Hall's 2J had threatened to transform Can-Am. Cornering speeds increased dramatically. Lap times dropped by seconds rather than tenths. Cars that didn't adopt ground effect became instantly obsolete. And the FIA, Formula One's governing body, eventually responded in exactly the same way the SACA had responded to the 2J. They banned sliding skirts. They mandated flat bottoms. They progressively restricted the tools that engineers could use to exploit ground effect. The cycle of innovation, dominance, political resistance, and regulatory restriction played out over a longer timeline, but the pattern was identical. Hall had seen it all before. He had lived it before. And he had predicted, with remarkable accuracy, that banning his car would not eliminate the engineering principle it embodied. It would simply delay its adoption and ensure that when it finally arrived, it would arrive in a form that was less elegant, less effective, and more dangerous than what he had originally proposed. Now, you might be thinking that banning radical innovations is necessary for safety, and there's a legitimate argument to be made on those grounds. The 2J's sudden loss of downforce when the suction system failed was genuinely dangerous. A car that goes from generating 6,000 pounds of downforce to generating essentially zero in a fraction of a second, in the middle of a high-speed corner, is a car that can kill its driver. This is not a hypothetical concern. It is a real, physical, engineering reality that Hall himself acknowledged throughout the car's development. But here's the counter-argument, and it's one that Hall made eloquently in the years following the 2J's retirement. Every racing car in history has been dangerous. Wings fail, tires deflate, suspension components break, engines seize. All of these failures can cause sudden, catastrophic loss of control. The solution to these risks has never been to ban wings, tires, suspensions, or engines. The solution has been to develop more reliable components, better safety systems, more forgiving circuit designs, and more rigorous inspection protocols. Had the 2J been allowed to continue, Hall argued, the reliability problems that plagued its first season would have been systematically addressed and resolved. Better drive couplings, more durable skirt materials, redundant fan systems, electronic monitoring of the suction differential with automated warnings to the driver if pressure was falling below safe thresholds. All of these solutions were technically feasible with 1970s technology. None of them were ever developed because the car was banned before the engineering team had the opportunity to refine them. The establishment chose prohibition over development, and in doing so, they ensured that the most dramatic failure mode of the 2J, the sudden total loss of downforce, remained forever associated with the concept, rather than being recognized as an early development challenge that would have been solved with time and resources. The human stories that surround the 2J are as compelling as the engineering. Vic Elford, the man who drove the car in competition, went on to a distinguished career in international motorsport, but he never forgot the white box from Midland, Texas. In interviews conducted decades after the car's retirement, Elford described the experience of driving the 2J with a specificity and emotional intensity that is genuinely remarkable for a man who drove some of the most significant racing cars of his era. He called the sensation of unlimited grip addictive. He said that once you had experienced what was possible with active downforce, every other racing car felt compromised. Every other car was fighting against physics, negotiating with the laws of tire adhesion, begging the rubber for more grip than it naturally wanted to provide. The 2J didn't negotiate. It didn't beg. It simply overrode the normal limitations of tire adhesion with mechanical force and created a driving experience that existed outside the normal parameters of motorsport. Elford was in his 80s when he gave his most detailed interview about the car, and his voice still carried a quality of wonder that transcended nostalgia. This wasn't a man reminiscing about the good old days. This was a man describing an experience that had fundamentally altered his understanding of what was possible. Don Gates, the General Motors engineer who had been assigned to the project and who had initially thought Hall was joking when he described the concept, returned to GM after the 2J's retirement and went on to contribute to multiple high-performance vehicle programs throughout the 1970s and 1980s. The aerodynamicists who studied the 2J's ground effect principles during its development influenced a generation of vehicle designers, not just in racing, but in commercial automotive applications, where aerodynamic efficiency and vehicle stability are critical design parameters. The knowledge generated by the 2J project didn't disappear when the dust cover went over the car. It dispersed into the broader engineering community, influencing work in fields that Hall had never intended to affect. Modern simulation technology has allowed contemporary engineers to study the 2J's concept with tools that were inconceivable in 1970. Computational fluid dynamics modeling, which allows engineers to simulate airflow patterns with extraordinary precision, has been applied to the 2J's design by multiple academic and commercial research groups. The results are simultaneously validating and tantalizing. Computer models confirm that Hall's basic concept was sound, that the fan extraction system worked essentially as designed, and that the performance observed during the car's brief competitive career was consistent with the aerodynamic forces being generated. But the simulations also suggest something more provocative. With modern materials, modern electronic control systems, modern fan technology, and modern sealing systems, a 2J-style suction car could generate lateral acceleration forces exceeding 5 grams. 5 grams sustained through a corner. For context, the most advanced modern Formula One cars generate peak lateral forces of approximately 6 grams, but only in high-speed corners where aerodynamic downforce is at its maximum. A modern suction car could generate 5G+ at any speed, including low-speed corners where current F1 cars might generate only 2 or 3 grams. The performance implications are almost incomprehensible. They are also, it must be acknowledged, beyond the physiological limits of unassisted human drivers. At 5 grams sustained lateral acceleration, blood pools in the extremities, vision narrows, consciousness becomes compromised. A modern suction car, built with today's technology to the limit of what the physics allows, would require either autonomous control systems or pilots wearing fighter aircraft-style G-suits with active physiological support. The car that Jim Hall built in 1970, with snowmobile engines and Lexan skirts and military surplus fans, was already approaching the limits of what a human being could physically tolerate. A modern version would exceed those limits comprehensively. The philosophical questions raised by the 2J remain as relevant today as they were in 1970, perhaps more so as racing continues to navigate the tension between technological freedom and competitive equity. Should racing reward the best engineering solution, wherever that solution leads, regardless of how disruptive it might be to existing competitive structures? Or should racing prioritize close competition between evenly matched machinery, ensuring that driver skill, rather than engineering superiority, determines the outcome? These questions have no definitive answers because they reflect fundamentally different philosophies about what racing is and what it should aspire to be. Jim Hall believed, passionately and articulately, that racing should be an arena for unrestricted engineering creativity. The best solution should win, even if the best solution makes every other approach obsolete. This philosophy produced the 2J, and it produced a car that was too good for the sport that hosted it. The opposing view, held equally passionately by McLaren and the other teams who lobbied for the 2J's elimination, is that racing is fundamentally entertainment. Fans come to see battles, to see overtaking, to see human courage and skill under pressure. A car that wins every race by 30 seconds doesn't provide entertainment regardless of how brilliant its engineering might be. A technological arms race that only the wealthiest teams can participate in doesn't produce exciting racing. It produces predictable processions. Here's the thing that makes this debate irresolvable. Both sides are right. Racing is engineering competition and entertainment simultaneously. The tension between these two identities has shaped every major decision in motorsport history, from the banning of the 2J to the introduction of the budget cap in modern Formula One. Every rule change, every technical directive, every regulatory intervention represents a recalibration of the balance between innovation and competition, between engineering freedom and sporting equity. The 2J sits at one extreme of that spectrum, a car that prioritized engineering excellence so completely that it threatened to make competition itself meaningless. The three surviving 2J chassis have become objects of almost religious significance within the motorsport collector community. The primary car, the machine that Vic Elford raced at Road America and Watkins Glen and Laguna Seca and Riverside, resides in the Petroleum Museum in Midland, Texas. Jim Hall, who remained in Midland throughout his life, personally oversaw its preservation and maintenance for decades. The car is occasionally started for demonstration purposes, and even after more than 50 years, the experience of hearing those fans spin up, of watching the chassis compress under self-generated downforce, creates a visceral reaction in everyone who witnesses it. There is something fundamentally unsettling about watching a stationary car press itself into the ground through invisible force. It looks wrong. It looks like a violation of natural law, which is, in the most literal sense, exactly what Jim Hall intended it to be. The preservation of the 2J in Midland is itself a statement, a deliberate act of historical insistence by a man who never fully accepted the verdict that racing passed on his creation. Hall understood that the car's competitive record, 4 races, 0 victories, would be the first thing that casual observers noticed. He wanted the physical reality of the machine itself to provide the counter-argument. Stand next to it, watch it run. Feel the air being evacuated from beneath its floor. Then tell me this car was a failure. The record shows failures. The car itself shows something categorically different. It shows a solution so complete, so thorough, so devastatingly effective that the only way to defeat it was to change the rules of the game entirely. That's not failure. That's a different kind of victory, quieter and more durable than any trophy, but no less real. Jim Hall's career in motorsport extended well beyond the 2J. He continued racing and developing cars through the 1970s and into the 1980s, achieving considerable success in other categories including kart IndyCar, racing where his Chaparral team won multiple championships. But nothing he built before or after carried the same revolutionary charge as the 2J. In his later years, Hall gave increasingly detailed interviews about the car, and a consistent theme emerges from all of them. He was never bitter about the banning, or at least he was careful never to present himself as bitter. What he expressed instead was something more nuanced and more interesting. He was disappointed by what the banning represented about the nature of motorsport as an institution, not disappointed that he personally had been treated unfairly, though he clearly believed he had been. Disappointed that an institution that presented itself as a celebration of engineering excellence and competitive innovation had revealed, when genuinely tested by radical innovation, that its commitment to those values was conditional. Innovation was welcome, but only innovation that didn't threaten the existing power structures too comprehensively. Progress was encouraged, but only progress that moved slowly enough for everyone to follow. The 2J had moved too fast, too far, too completely, and the institution had reacted accordingly. Here's what most people don't realize about how the 2J's legacy manifests in modern motorsport. It's not visible in any single car or any specific technology. It's visible in the rulebooks. Every major racing series on the planet carries, somewhere in its technical regulations, language that can be traced either directly or philosophically back to the Chaparral 2J and the regulatory response it provoked. The prohibition on movable aerodynamic devices, the restrictions on powered ground effect systems, the careful definitions of what constitutes aerodynamic downforce and what constitutes mechanical grip. All of these regulatory frameworks were shaped, at least in part, by the experience of watching Jim Hall's white box from Texas make the entire field of a major racing series look irrelevant in qualifying. When modern Formula One engineers propose a new aerodynamic concept, one of the first questions their regulatory affairs teams ask is whether it resembles anything that has previously been banned. The ghost of the 2J haunts those conversations in ways that most of the participants may not even fully recognize. The return of ground effect to Formula One in 2022, when the sport adopted the current generation of technical regulations explicitly designed to harness Venturi tunnel aerodynamics, was celebrated as a progressive step toward faster, more spectacular racing. And it was. But it was also viewed through a longer historical lens, a partial vindication of everything Jim Hall had argued 50 years earlier. The underside of the car is where the important aerodynamic work happens. The relationship between the floor and the track surface generates more useful downforce more efficiently than any configuration of wings and spoilers mounted above the bodywork. These are the principles that Hall demonstrated with the 2J in 1970. Formula One spent the intervening decades trying various other approaches, banning ground effect, reintroducing it in limited forms, banning it again, until finally arriving in 2022 at a set of regulations that essentially acknowledged Hall's insight as fundamental truth. He was right in 1970. It just took the sport until 2022 to fully admit it. Now, you might be thinking that this kind of vindication, arriving half a century late, is cold comfort for a man who invested millions of dollars and years of engineering effort into a car that competed in 4 races and never won. And there's truth in that observation. But consider the alternative perspective. Every engineering concept eventually finds its time. Every idea that is genuinely correct, genuinely effective, genuinely superior to the alternatives, eventually becomes accepted wisdom. The only question is how long the journey takes and how much resistance the idea encounters along the way. The 2J's journey from radical experiment to foundational principle took 50 years. By the standards of truly paradigm-shifting ideas, that's not particularly long. Continental drift was proposed in 1912 and wasn't accepted by the geological mainstream until the 1960s. The germ theory of disease was ridiculed for decades before becoming the foundation of modern medicine. Jim Hall's insight about speed-independent downforce achieved mainstream acceptance in a single human lifetime. In the grand sweep of how ideas move through institutions, that's practically instantaneous. The drivers who competed against the 2J, those who feared it, those who lobbied against it, those who filed the protests that contributed to its eventual banning, have largely been consistent in their retrospective assessments. With the passage of decades and the removal of competitive pressure, the hostility has faded. What remains is something closer to honest admiration mixed with honest acknowledgement of self-interest. Yes, the car was brilliant. Yes, it was faster than anything else. Yes, banning it was motivated at least partly by fear and self-preservation, rather than purely by technical or safety concerns. Most of the engineers and team managers who lived through the 2J era will say these things openly now, in interviews and memoirs, and the kind of candid conversations that only happen when careers are over and reputations are secure. The political campaign against the 2J was conducted with the full awareness that the car's primary offense was not being dangerous or illegal, but being too good. Everyone knew it at the time. Almost no one was willing to say it publicly. The passage of time has loosened those constraints considerably. This is where it gets really interesting from a broader cultural perspective, Because the story of the Chaparral 2J is not really a story about racing. It's a story about innovation and institutional resistance that plays out in virtually every field of human endeavor. Technology companies face regulatory capture from established industries that feel threatened by disruptive new approaches. Pharmaceutical companies encounter institutional resistance to genuinely novel treatment approaches. Architectural firms find that truly radical designs face planning resistance that more conventional proposals don't encounter. The specific details change. The fundamental dynamic doesn't. When an innovation is sufficiently transformative, when it doesn't just improve on existing approaches, but renders them obsolete, the institutions built around those existing approaches will resist it. Not necessarily through malice, though malice is sometimes present. More often through the entirely human and entirely understandable instinct towards self-preservation. The Can-Am teams that lobbied against the 2J weren't villains. They were people who had invested their careers and their money in a particular approach to a particular problem. And they were confronted with evidence that their approach was fundamentally inferior. Their response was predictable because it was human. Hall himself drew this broader lesson explicitly in his later years. He was fond of pointing out that the 2J's story demonstrated something important not just about motorsport, but about the relationship between innovation and established systems generally. Truly radical innovation doesn't get evaluated on its merits alone. It gets evaluated on its merits relative to the disruption it causes and the interests it threatens. A better solution is not automatically a welcome solution. Sometimes, frequently, the better solution is the most threatening solution, and threatening solutions get eliminated by threatened institutions. This is not cynicism, it is observation. And the 2J provides as clear an illustration of this dynamic as any example in the history of technology. The question that Hall said he was asked most often in the final decades of his life was simple and impossible. What if the 2J had been allowed to continue? What would Can-Am racing have looked like by 1972 or 1973 if suction cars had been permitted to develop? What would Formula One have looked like if the BT-46B had raced for a full season in 1978? Hall's answer was always careful and characteristically precise. He didn't speculate about specific performance numbers or competitive outcomes. He made a more fundamental point. If radical innovation had been allowed to flourish rather than being systematically suppressed, motorsport would have discovered far sooner what it eventually discovered anyway. That the floor of the car is more important than the top. That active aerodynamics are more effective than passive ones. That speed-independent downforce transforms vehicle dynamics in ways that make conventional aerodynamics look primitive by comparison. The sport would have gotten to where it eventually arrived, but it would have arrived earlier, with better understanding, and with the benefit of the engineering knowledge that would have been generated by allowing genuinely revolutionary ideas to compete freely. Instead, it took 50 years of regulatory suppression, followed by gradual reintroduction, followed by eventual acceptance, to reach conclusions that Jim Hall had demonstrated in 4 races at the dawn of the 1970s. The Chaparral 2J remains, more than half a century after its retirement, the greatest what-if in motorsport history. Not because it was the fastest car ever built, though in its era it was arguably exactly that. Not because it won the most races, though it won none, but because it represents the most complete answer ever provided to the fundamental question of racing engineering. How do you make a car go faster around a circuit? You make it grip the road with more force than physics would normally allow. You override the natural limitations of tire adhesion with mechanical assistance. You generate downforce that doesn't depend on speed, that doesn't diminish in slow corners, that works as hard at 30 miles per hour as at 130. You build the Chaparral 2J, and then you watch the establishment ban it. Not because it doesn't work, but because it works too perfectly. Standing beside the preserved car in Midland today, looking at that boxy white body and those industrial fans and those Lexan skirts, it's tempting to feel sadness for what was lost. 4 races. 0 victories. $2 million. One extraordinary engineering vision, extinguished before it could fully bloom. But here's the thing about ideas that are genuinely correct. They don't die when the physical embodiment of them gets covered with a dust sheet in a workshop in Texas. They persist. They migrate. They find new expressions in new contexts with new technology. The 2J's operating principle lives in every ground effect racing car ever built. It lives in the active aerodynamic systems of modern hypercars. It lives in the academic papers that still cite Hall's patents. It lives in the rulebooks that were written specifically to prevent anyone from ever doing what Hall did again, which is itself the most powerful possible acknowledgement that what Hall did was real, and it worked, and it was everything he said it was. Jim Hall didn't just build a race car. He built a proof of concept for a better way of thinking about vehicle dynamics. He demonstrated, with more clarity and more force than any paper or presentation or simulation could have achieved, that the received wisdom about how racing cars generate grip was incomplete. He showed that there was another way, a better way, and that the better way was available to anyone with the engineering courage to pursue it. The fact that racing chose not to pursue it, that it chose instead to suppress and prohibit and regulate away the evidence that Hall had provided, says everything about institutions and nothing about the idea itself. The idea was right. The idea remains right. And 50 years from now, when motorsport historians look back at this era, the Chaparral 2J will be remembered not as a car that failed to win races, but as a car that was right about everything, built by an engineer who was right about everything, in a sport that wasn't ready to be that right, that fast, that completely. What do you think? Should the 2J have been allowed to race, to develop, to potentially transform motorsport entirely? Or was banning it the right decision for the health of the sport? Let me know in the comments below, because this is exactly the kind of debate that has no clean answer and never will. And if this deep dive into one of the most extraordinary machines in motorsport history gave you something to think about, something to argue about, something to go away and research further, then make sure you're subscribed, because this is what we do here at Motorsport Heritage. We find the stories that the record books don't tell completely. The cars that changed everything without winning anything. The engineers who were right before the world was ready for them to be right. Until next time, keep asking what if, even when the answer makes everyone else uncomfortable.